Yo guys, what is up? Max on a Diablo 4 video, and today we're talking about how the classes are going to stack up at endgame. Now, we can see the characters' entire skill trees. We have all of their paragon points. We have a lot of their legendary aspects and some uniques, and the picture is starting to become clear of how these characters are going to shake up at endgame. Now, in the betas and the beta tests, we've looked at what characters are the strongest, what characters do the most damage. However, if you played a Diablo endgame, you know that at a certain point you get to in difficulty where the enemies are able to start hitting you back, where you're no longer one-shotting things, where things are living more than a second or two. And at that point, you need defenses, you need unstoppable, you need crowd control reduction, you need CCs, you need damage reduction, you need armor, you need defenses. And we really haven't looked too much at the defenses of the characters, so that's what we're going to look at today, is how the characters are going to shake up not only in damage, but how their on-paper defenses are going to stack up to the hardest difficulty content in Diablo 4, and put together a tier list based off of the information that is available to us. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Let's get right into it. So to start our tier list, we're going to be ranking the Necromancer, and I want to place the Necromancer in B tier. Now, I think the Necromancer is going to have some of the highest damage for your first playthrough, and around Act 3, you get a Bone Spear Augment that's going to give you around 200% increased damage for your Bone Splinters on vulnerable enemies. I think this is going to carry you all the way to level 50 and probably up until your World Tier 3 dungeon test. Now, where I think the Necromancer is going to struggle is survivability. On paper, the Necromancer has the least survivability out of any of the classes. I think you're going to gain a lot of survivability from having all of your minions summoned and having them take hits for you. But in comparison to like the Rogue and the Sorcerer, who are the other two like quote unquote squishy classes with the Necromancer sitting at about half as much damage reduction on paper in your skill tree. You can pick up another 15% damage reduction, but all scenarios included, Necromancer's got about 55% damage reduction available to them in your skill tree. And obviously, if you have minions, you're going to be taking more, they're able to tank damage for you. However, the Necromancer also doesn't have as much crowd control, doesn't have great sources of unstoppable. I think getting crowd controlled at endgame is going to very much lead to your death, and so that's why I'm going to put Necromancer in B tier. Now, Necromancer does have survivability options. I think the Blood build, a Blood Overpower build, is probably going to be quite strong at endgame and give you some of the survivability that you're missing. We saw the Corpse Explosion build where you're immune to damage all the time. That could be pretty interesting. However, just on paper, the Necromancer is going to be easily the squishiest class, and those crowd controls could lead to your death very, very quickly, and so that's why I put Necromancer in B tier. Up next, we've got the Rogue class, and we'll be placing the Rogue in A tier. Now, the Rogue is a character that I was a little bit worried about survivability-wise. I was like, oh, this class does so much freaking damage, it's got to have some weak spots. And when I looked through their Paragon boards and their skill tree, the Rogue actually has quite a good amount of survivability. You've got a skill that is going to heal you for 3% of your maximum life whenever you critically strike a close by enemy. You've got easy access to unstoppable when you use concealment to go invisible. You've got tons of damage reduction in your skill tree, mainly through the use of the Dusk Shroud skill, which will give you stacks of damage reduction. And all in all things considered, in your skill tree, you're sitting at around 87% damage reduction. On top of that, you've got a Paragon board with 20 plus damage reduction nodes in comparison to like the Necromancer, which had, I think, like 3 damage reduction nodes in their entire Paragon board. So the Rogue is looking really, really strong. Now, why isn't the Rogue in S tier? Now, the Rogue's got crazy single target damage. It's got pretty good AoE clear. However, I think where it might struggle a little bit is in terms of crowd controlling enemies. It just doesn't have as much crowd control as some of the other characters, but if everything's dead, it's not going to really matter. Once again, I think once you start to take those hits and lose those Dust Shrouds, if you're getting hit a lot and you're starting to lose those Dust Shrouds and you can't maintain them, I think the Rogue could be going down relatively quickly, but on paper, this class is looking at like a fantastic choice for endgame. Up next, we've got the Sorceress, which I'll also be placing in A tier. I think the Sorceress is going to be just slightly behind the Rogue, even though the Sorceress on paper is sitting at a bit more survivability than the Rogue. I don't think the Sorceress is going to have the single target damage quite as much as the rogue does, and when your single target damage isn't killing things as fast, bosses, for example, are going to have a higher chance to hit you, and I think that's where the Sorceress might struggle a bit more. However, against groups and crowds, the Sorceress is going to be absolutely incredible. First off, you've got fire builds with tons of immobilize to make enemies not be able to move. You've got the lightning builds, which have tons of stun, and you've got the ice builds, which are perma-freeze and chill. The Sorceress is going to absolutely excel when it comes to mobbing. In terms of crowd control, the Sorceress has some of the most. You've got easy ways to generate barriers for yourself with the ice build, and you actually have quite a bit of damage reduction in your skill tree in all scenarios, meaning like against close, against far, against elites. The Sorceress is stacking up about 90% damage reduction in your full built out skill tree, and you have 20 plus damage reduction nodes in your Paragon board. And these damage reduction nodes are like damage reduction from burning enemies, or burning enemies deal less damage, damage reduction from chilled enemies. I think the Sorceress is going to have a decent amount of survivability. However, all of those crowd control effects I think are going to be less effective when it comes to those bossings, those super hard elites. And when those super hard elites are starting to hit you, that's where the Sorceress I think is going to struggle a bit. You do have a good amount of life gen, aka you heal from burning enemies. You're going to be healing 1.8% of your maximum life on elites or bosses, and then around, I think it's like 0.9% of your health when you're hitting like regular mobs. And obviously when you're in a big room, that's a lot of healing from all those burning enemies. And I think the Sorceress is going to excel at those big groups. But once again, once it comes down to those one-on-one fights, I do think the Sorceress is going to struggle a bit more than the Rogue, and that's why I put the Rogue in A tier, or the Sorceress in A tier, just behind the Rogue. Up next, we've got the Barbarian, and I'm going to be placing the Barbarian in S tier. I know that sounds a little bit crazy because the Barbarian was probably one of the weaker classes in the beta, but once you saw that character get built up, the Barbarian was putting out some of the highest damage numbers of any of the classes, and that's primarily due to the Barbarian having 4 weapons. All of the stats on the Barbarian's weapons act as stat sticks, and as we see those levels increase, those percentages increase, those stat sticks are going to become more and more impactful and will lead to the Barbarian outputting some ridiculous damage. Now, the Barbarian has seen some tweaks to its damage. It's already been nerfed, probably more than some of the other classes have been in terms of its damage output, but when you look at on paper what this class is going to be able to do, it's kind of crazy. Now, in terms of damage reduction, the Barbarian in its skill tree has a 106% damage reduction, so I don't think survivability is going to be too much of an issue this class later. I think the Barbarian is probably going to be one of the harder campaign playthroughs though, and unlocking World Tier 3 is also probably going to be a lot more difficult on this class than its counterparts in the Rogue, Sorceress, and Necromancer, and that's because a lot of its damage is going to come online a lot later. The Barbarian's got 25 plus damage reduction nodes in their Paragon board, and with the triple shout Barbarian, which I'm personally going to be rocking, you're able to heal for 9% of your maximum life per second, and with some artifacts that you get up later, you get perma activation of your shouts. So you've got all your shouts always active, you've always got all your fury active, and also you've got that skill that's going to give you a 135% increased damage with your core skills. I think the Barbarian is going to come online much later than all these other classes on this current tier list, but once they do come online, I think they're going to be an absolute monster for dealing with the hardest endgame content possible in Diablo 4. And lastly, we've got the Druid. Now, I'm going to be placing the Druid in S tier, slightly above the Barbarian. I do believe that the Druid is going to be the strongest character at endgame for the hardest content in Diablo 4. Now, the Druid is probably not going to be my first character because I think it's going to have a rougher time through that campaign. I did not enjoy my time on my Druid leveling it to 25 as nearly as much as I did on the other characters, but once the Druid gets to its level 50, once it starts getting to its Paragon boards, once it unlocks some of those harder aspects, the Druid has undoubtedly the highest amount of survivability and some of the highest damage out of any of the classes. It just comes online so much later, so I want to show you guys some of that stuff. All right, are you ready for it? The Druid on paper has a 196% damage reduction. That is triple the Necromancers and almost double the Barbarians. The Druid is going to be an absolute nightmare for enemies to kill. Not only do you have on paper an absurd amount of damage reduction, but you also have a lot of mechanics built around being tanky. And when you're being tanky or fortified, dealing more damage, you are incentivized damage-wise to be more tanky on this character. Other characters also have some of this mechanic, but not nearly as much as Druid. You've got tons of ways to fortify. You've got almost perma uptime of unstoppable with some of your things that are going to increase the duration of your ultimates and restore ultimate cooldown, so you'll be unstoppable a lot of the time, as well as having so much damage reduction and being an absolute unit for your team. I think the Druid is going to be one of the most valuable characters to have on your team playing with you. Druid also has one of the strongest skills that we've seen for survivability in Debilitating Roar. This is going to reduce enemies' damage that they deal by 70%. This is for you and your teammates, so really, really good co-op skill, as well as fortifying you, and it'll slow enemies' action speed by 65%. For its duration. So enemies not only are going to deal 70% less damage, but they also they'll be 65% slower. This skill alone has more survivability than a lot of other characters' entire skill tree. The Druid is just an absolute monster when it comes to endgame. Druid also won't be lacking in damage when it comes to late game. There's a lot of weird double dipping things that you can do where you change your storm skills into werewolf skills, you change your shapeshifting skills into earth skills, and then you can get multipliers from both of those groups of skills and use them to do some pretty ridiculous damage. Just a quick glance here, we've got 260% increased damage of our pulverize that goes into a shockwave. Pulverize is now an earth skill, and it creates tectonic spikes that deal damage. And then while we have fortify, our earth skills gain +2 ranks. And then there's a synergy in this skill tree that when you critically strike with earth skills, you get fortify for 77% of your base life. You're just going to be hitting enemies with Druid with all of your skills, fortifying your life, giving you more damage. And it'll be a feedback loop of just healing yourself and dealing more damage, healing yourself, dealing more damage. I think Druid's going to be fantastic. Guys, that is going to do it for the video. At the end of the day, this is just my opinions using the information that's in front of me to make educated guesses. I'm more than happy to be wrong, and if you have a different opinion, let me know why you think one class is going to be weaker or stronger. I think at the end of the day, all the classes are going to be able to do endgame. It just depends on how easy of a time they're going to have it at those higher difficulties and if they'll be able to push up to that extra pinnacle Nightmare 100 level. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it informative. Don't take this to like change your character off of. If you were going to play Necromancer, play the character that you enjoy their playstyle. That's what's going to be the most important at the end of the day, because class balance could change. They could nerf the damage reductions of certain skills or buff the damage reduction of other things and throw this whole thing around. But going into launch, this is how I think the classes are going to shake up. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will catch y'all in the next one. Take care, guys. Peace.